I got me some fucking autism. Can't you tell?
Hello and welcome to Tismo Talks, a comic book podcast where I, the aforementioned Tismo, talk your ear off about my special interests. I, of course, am your permanent host, Brady, and I hope you guys are having a wonderful day. So, as this is the first episode, I feel like I should get the introductory stuff just out of the way. So this podcast is mainly an outlet just for me to talk about stuff I like comic books or video games or TV shows or superheroes or anything within that little sphere. Now, this is called a comic book podcast, but I plan to cover some topics that are not exclusively comic book based. Me personally, am more of a DC fan than Marvel, which is kind of funny because, as you know by the title and thumbnail, this is a Marvel-centered episode, but I can talk about Marvel if I like the character, which is why I'm talking about the spectacular Spider-Man, because Spider-Man is probably my favorite character from Marvel, honestly. He was the first superhero I ever saw in the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies and a couple episodes of this show. The Spectacular Spider-Man was created by a guy named Greg Weisman and his writing partner, Victor Cook. Greg Weisman is a huge comic book fan. If you're a DC fan like myself, you will recognize his name from Young Justice. So that should give you an idea of how damn good this show is. Which leads me to how I got introduced to the Spectacular Spider-Man. I didn't catch it on TV. It only aired for 2 years, and I didn't catch it on TV because I was 5 when the show ended. So, yeah, I never saw it on TV. However, I did see it when my mother rented a DVD from Redbox. That's nostalgia for you 2000s babies. The Symbiote arc. It was one DVD that contained all 4 of the Symbiote episodes. I watched it all the freaking time we had it. Like, literally every single day we had it, I watched the crap out of it, and I loved it, even though I didn't understand some of the things that were going on. Like, I didn't know who Black Cat was, I didn't know who the Chameleon was, but that's spoilers for a later episode. For a while, that was actually all I saw of this show. It wasn't until a few years later when a Cartoon Network called The Hub started airing older Marvel and DC cartoons. They had Batman Beyond. I believe they even had Batman the Animated Series, which is how I first discovered that show. And they had a couple episodes, well, at least my mom DVR'd, a couple episodes of The Spectacular Spider-Man. Watched those episodes, realized it was the same show as the one I saw when I was a kid, and I fell in love with the show all over again. Fast forward to now, and I own the entire series box set of the show on DVD, which is how I watched it and took notes on it for this episode. So I feel like I should also talk about my structure for reviewing these episodes and my reviews just in general on this show. What I'm going to start with in every episode is I'm going to give a full episode synopsis / breakdown. Of course, I'm not going to know all the Easter eggs, because like I said at the top, I have only ever read the Ultimate Spider-Man comics. If there is an Easter egg I miss, feel free to let me know in the comments. After I, go over all that stuff and give the breakdown and the Easter eggs, I'm going to talk about my thoughts about the episode, whether I think it was written well, and how I rate it. My rating scale is going to be out of 5 of Aunt May's wheat cakes, 1 being absolute crap, which will probably never happen because I don't think there's a single terrible episode of the show, and of course the highest supreme rating being 5 out of 5 wheat cakes. But the review segment will happen right after the breakdown. So I will say as well, before I break down these episodes, if somehow you haven't seen The Spectacular Spider-Man, do yourself a favor, find a way to watch the show, because it is amazing. We open the episode with Spider-Man running across the rooftops, passing by some gargoyles along the way, because it's a Greg Weisman show and there has to be a gargoyles reference at least once. After doing a quick bypass of J. Jonah Jameson's office, Spidey thinks to himself that it's his last night before the school year begins, and he needs some action. but not in the fun way. As he says this, a burglar alarm goes off from a nearby jewelry store, and we see that 2 men are exiting the rooftop door with bags slung over their shoulders. These men are named Alex O'Hearn, which I just figured out while watching these the first time through. If you rearrange the letters of Alex's name, it's literally the word rhino. So that's a little fun tidbit I found out by just actually using my fucking brain for once. O'Hearn's cohort is named Flint Marko. Those of you who have seen the Spider-Man 3 movie, as well as No Way Home, or if you've played the Spider-Man 2 game on PlayStation 5, you will know who Flint Marko is. If you don't know who he is, well, you'll find out soon. O'Hearn tells Marko to tamper his expectations about this job, as someone named the Big Man will presumably be taking a huge cut out of their loot from this job. Marko and O'Hearn are stopped by Spider-Man, as he states, for the 3rd time this summer, and the video footage of this is shown to a mysterious figure via laptop by a crime boss known as Hammerhead. We then go to the Parker residence, where Peter Parker changes into his normal clothes over his Spider-Man suit, and heads downstairs, where he overhears a conversation between Aunt May and a friend of hers about the Parker family money problems, which kinda worries Peter a little bit. Understandably so. After this, we go to Oscorp, where a man named Adrian Toombs yells at another scientist named Dr. Otto Octavius for selling out his magnetic air transport system to Norman Osborn, and it's implied that Norman used this idea to create a program called Tech Flight. That will come back later in a huge way. Norman gaslights the shit out of Adrian Toombs because he tells him that he didn't steal the idea from him, and he calls him a crazy old buzzard who never accomplished anything in his life, before having him escorted out of the building by 2 big security guards in sunglasses. I specified what they look like because, again, that will come back later. One thing to realize with Greg Weisman shows, he doesn't do anything by accident. Ever. We cut over to Midtown Magnet School, which I don't necessarily know what that means. I've just heard Greg Weisman refer to it as a magnet school. If anyone knows what that is, please feel free to leave it in the comments, whether you're on Spotify or YouTube, because you can leave comments for podcasts on Spotify now, which is kind of cool. Anyway, at the school, Peter meets up with 2 of his best friends, Harry Osborn and Gwen Stacy. They all talk about their summer vacations, with Harry making a joke about how his dad was locked in boardrooms while Harry spent all of his summer vacation locked in boredom. That joke actually made me laugh way more than it should have. Suddenly, Peter decides to grow a bigger pair of balls than me in high school, and he tries to ask out a cheerleader named Sally Averill. Sally rejects Peter in front of Flash Thompson, his lead bully, and his goon squad. Peter tries to antagonize Flash, but ends up getting humiliated, and Flash steals his lunch, because he's just a dick. Flash actually is one of my favorite characters in this show. He goes through a huge redemption arc midway through the series, and you actually kind of grow to like him more as the series goes on, and he's actually kind of funny sometimes. We then go to a warehouse where a speaker device sits on a random stool in the middle of the room. Even watching the episode, it's kind of goofy, because there's nothing in the warehouse. It's literally just a fucking wooden stool with a speaker on top of it. Anyway, Hammerhead leads 3 men known as the Enforcers into this room, and they use the radio to listen to a mysterious voice ask them to kill Spider-Man. Back at Midtown High, the teacher, Aaron Warren, is wrapping up his lesson as the bell rings and everyone is let out of class. Everybody but Peter and Gwen, that is. They're offered an internship at Kurt Connor's lab, the very same lab where Peter was bitten by the spider months prior. Sorry to interrupt the flow of the episode, but I want to take some time out of every episode to tell you guys about things I think are cool, whether that be a video game I've been playing recently, a comic I've been reading, a YouTube video I watched that I thought was funny, or a podcast I like. I want to take a second to plug a very, very, very cool podcast called Flashbacks, a Flash Rewatch podcast. It's hosted by guys named Alex and Will, and basically what they do is they talk about the CW Flash TV show. At the time of recording and releasing this episode, they are only on the first season of the show. Alex was kind enough to have me on the show, and we chatted about the unproduced David Goyer Flash script. Unfortunately, that episode hasn't been released at the time of this recording, but if you check my Instagram, which I plug at the end of the show, I will be promoting the hell out of my episode appearance. So be on the lookout for that, and give it a listen when it comes out. I'll try to do these every episode, if I remember, but if I forget sometimes, don't come at me, okay? Anyway, back to the episode, where I sound weird because I have allergies at the moment. We go to Norman's big-ass apartment. Like, seriously, that thing is unnecessarily huge. I get Norman's rich, but he could just live in, like, a house inside of a mountain, or on a mountain, you know? Apartment building being that big is kind of unnecessary. It's here where Peter and Harry hang out for a little bit, since Peter doesn't have to be at the lab for another hour. Harry mentions that he's surprised Pete isn't at the school paper since he's their star photographer, and Peter basically just says that they can go fuck themselves because he's going to be making big science money like Norman. Norman calls both Peter and Harry into his office. Knowing what they were called in for, Peter apologizes to Norman, which again, Norman tells Peter not to, since Norman Osborn never apologizes. Norman takes an interest in the lab job, and Peter mentions that it's being run by Curt Connors, who is a friend of Norman's, apparently. This interaction between Peter, Harry, and Norman is cut short when Vulture kidnaps Norman Osborn and flies him around the city. Peter tells Harry to run inside and go call the cops. Peter then takes his shoes off and leaves them on the roof before jumping off. Toombs reveals via dialogue he kidnapped Norman to show what his magnetic air transport system can really do. Norman then realizes that because of what Vulture's saying, that he's Adrian Toombs. Toombs is now calling himself the Vulture because it's what he thought Norman called him earlier. Obviously, if you've been listening, you know that Norman called him a buzzard. Vulture wants Norman to admit he stole the plans for tech flight and used them for his own personal gain. He also wants Norman to apologize. And as stated earlier, it's not going to happen. Vulture drops Norman, but Norman's caught by Spider-Man, who makes fun of him, calling him the ugliest, heaviest, and the first damsel he's ever saved. Vulture thought that Spider-Man was a myth, so his presence on this scene is a huge surprise to the Vulture. On the street, two cops are walking out of the police station. One is named Stan, and the other one is a lady whose name we won't come to know for another couple of episodes. The female officer makes a remark about how Spider-Man's methods don't help before Spidey literally throws Norman at her. Literally, like, as he's swinging, just freaking football tosses Norman into this officer. Like, that had to hurt, and they're on pavement, too. Spidey continues to chase Vulture and lectures him about great power and great responsibility. Vulture doesn't give a shit, and he flies away. Outside the ESU lab, Peter's on the phone with Harry, and he gives Harry an excuse for where he was during the encounter with the Vulture. He says to Harry that he tried to run a few blocks after the Vulture on foot before eventually losing him, thus making that whole effort completely useless. Peter and Harry say goodbye and hang up on each other as Peter meets up with Gwen Stacy, and they enter the lab. Inside the lab, we meet the Connors lab assistant, Eddie Brock, 'cause that's gonna end just fucking swimmingly. Peter and Eddie catch up as they're friends from childhood. Peter pokes fun at Eddie for being a freshman, but since he's not a high school freshman, that joke doesn't really affect Eddie. Eddie used to keep the bullies off Peter's back when he was in high school. Eddie brought that up because of the fact that Peter's shoes are missing. Seems like he left them back on the roof. Martha Connors enters and introduces herself, and once she's done with that, she calls for her husband Kurt, who's in a back office injecting his left shoulder with a mysterious green substance. Again, that's just gonna go super well. Like, people injecting themselves with green formulas in Spider-Man always turns out just the greatest. Kurt then enters the main lab and shakes the hand of Peter, whom he recognizes from the spider bite incident just a few months ago. Peter doesn't even let Kurt say the word spider, cutting him off and saying he was bitten by the science bug. when asked if he's the boy who was bitten by something. Eddie's instructed to give Peter and Gwen a tour, and he does so. Peter mentions getting paid for this work, and Eddie says they're teenagers with no experience, and they're not getting paid. Peter waits with Gwen for the bus outside, and he tells Gwen that he doesn't know how he's going to help Aunt May with her money troubles. Once Gwen gets on the bus, she tells Peter to wait, and the sign will come to him. After the bus leaves, Peter is left standing alone, waiting for his answer, as a lone newspaper flies right into his face. There's an article on the front page of the newspaper labeled Spider-Man Strikes. Peter then goes to the Daily Bugle, where he climbs up the building and enters through a window since security wouldn't even let him use the elevator. It's here where we're introduced to J. Jonah motherfucking Jameson, who just bosses everybody around angrily and yelling at them, not out of character for JJ. Jameson yells at one particular employee named Foswell, saying that he ordered rewrites 12 seconds ago. Jameson then turns his attention from a lazy employee named Ned Lee, who he just got done yelling at, to Peter, who is standing right in front of Jameson. Jameson mistakes him for an intern and yells at him for not having his bagel and schmear ready like he asked him to have 9 minutes ago. Betty Brandt, the secretary, walks by and informs Jameson that it's only been 3 minutes and he sent a guy named Benny to do that. Peter tells Jameson that he's actually here to give Jameson a proposal. He knows how he can sell more papers. Peter can get photos of Spider-Man in action, but Jameson yells at him and has Peter escorted out of the premises by 2 guards. Of course, Jameson turns right to Joe Robertson and says that photos of Spidey in action would actually sell more papers, taking credit for Peter's idea. Later that night, Spider-Man recovers the shoes he'd left on the roof of Norman's apartment building earlier, while down below, Norman's limousine pulls up and is tailed by the Vulture. Spider-Man follows shortly after. Spider-Man follows Vulture and Norman, but he's being followed by a helicopter piloted by Montana with Ox and Fancy Dan in the back. Spider-Man jumps on Vulture's back and they fight while flying all over the city. Spidey is then pushed off of Vulture's back and is dragged along by a web line which he attached to Vulture's foot. The enforcers shoot a net at Spider-Man, but before he can hit the ground, he webs a gargoyle to slow himself down. Because again, it's a Greg Weisman show. Of course he fucking webs a gargoyle. That maneuver is successful, except for the fact that the gargoyle almost turns him into Splatman, but we're just gonna ignore that. Ox and Fancy Dan attack Spider-Man as he's on the roof. Both sides actually manage to rough each other up pretty well, and as Spidey is about to escape the area, Montana shoots a fucking laser right at the area Spidey is trying to get to, thus completely blocking his escape plan. Vulture continues to tail Norman, even scratching the hood of his car with the foot claws that he has. Spider-Man is able to outsmart and defeat the enforcers, after which he pursues Norman and the Vulture. The roof of Norman's car is completely taken off. Vulture doesn't even use his claws to rip it off. He just grabs it with his bare hands and rips it right off. It's actually kind of cool. Vulture still wants Norman to apologize for being a douchebag and stealing his work, but Spider-Man is quick to stop Vulture before he can do anything by going onto his back and destroying part of the wings with the tail of the helicopter Montana's piloting. Spidey also takes off part of Vulture's backpack thing? I don't know. What do you call the thing on his back that his wings come out of? Whatever that thing is, Spider-Man breaks that and webs Vulture to a light post. He left Ox hanging from a flagpole on the side of a building, and Fancy Dan is just tied up with webs on the roof. Spidey goes to look in the helicopter, but there's no pilot. Spidey brushes that off and returns home to a worried Aunt May, who tells him that he can no longer be out past 10 p.m. If he is, he has to leave a call. And if he calls, he damn well better be on his way back home. As Peter monologues about all the things he loves in his life, we end the episode. So yeah, overall, I thought this was a really solid episode. The writing on this is just great. Everything is well executed, and I love this world that Greg Weisman has created. Doing this particular podcast episode has made me so excited to do more for this show. Like, you guys have no idea. It's a very funny episode as well. I actually found myself cackling like a fucking hyena at a couple jokes Peter makes, even if they're complete shit sometimes. As for the voice acting, I think everyone in this cast does a spectacular job. Josh Keaton is a perfect voice for Spider-Man, and he's actually one of my favorite Spidey voices, probably my favorite. John DiMaggio is also a complete standout here, because not only is he the voice of Flint Marko, he is also the voice of fucking Hammerhead. I didn't know that until I looked it up. I went on IMDb to see who played Hammerhead. Lo and behold, imagine my surprise when I found out fucking Bender from Futurama himself, Mr. Shiny Metal Ass, is freaking Hammerhead as well. Like, that blew my mind. Dude does a great job. One thing I don't get with this episode, Vulture's suit is black and red. I've read interviews with Greg Weisman where he talked about how he wanted to make almost all of Spidey's villains green. Because, like, Green Goblin, Mysterio, Electro, those guys are green and they're like his most menacing threats. Maybe they're homaging to the Ultimate comics where his suit is black and red, but it just feels like a weird choice here, especially when, you know, if you're trying to create a world with a lot of green color-schemed villains in it, and then you have the Vulture who's black and red but has a green suit in the comic. It's just weird. I don't get why they used a black and red suit. One thing I didn't talk about during the summary is that during the scene where he stops Marko and O'Hearn on top of the building, he uses the spider signal, and I think that is great. I think the spider signal needs to be used more, because it's very cool. It's a cool gadget that Spidey has, and he doesn't use it a lot. And of course, you know I can't talk about this show without talking about that freaking intro. Man, that intro fucking goes hard. I love it so much. It's definitely in my top 5 list of superhero intros, right under the Batman Season 1 and like Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes and Iron Man Armored Adventures, and even the 90s X-Men theme. Like, those are some of the greatest animated superhero opening themes of all time, and Spectacular Spider-Man definitely deserves to be up there. So, in terms of rating, what would I give this episode? This one's definitely a solid 5 out of 5. It is a great start to the series and does a wonderful job at setting the tone and introducing characters that, while they may not seem important now, will definitely be really important later. So I want to thank you guys a lot for listening and tuning into the show, whether you're on Spotify, YouTube, which has no actual video, by the way. It's just, you know, a picture, but I edited my voice over it. Or if you're listening on another platform, I still appreciate your listenership, and I hope you come back for my next episode. Do I know when that's going to be? Hell no. Am I going to make more? Hell yes. If you want to, you know, catch up with me, see what I'm doing outside of this show, you're welcome to follow me on Instagram, as that's really the only social media platform I use. It is the same username that is in the About page of this podcast and also under my creator profile on Spotify. Anyway, I'll see you guys next time.